all, before we get going, if anybody has a cell phone, please turn it off.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We had a baptism in my church 2 Sundays ago, and at least 3 cell phones went off during the baptism. Not ideal.
Be sure we take care of that. Okay. And, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here for this special program about the Dachau concentration camp. Dachau first, Dachau last, Dachau jamais plus. Our presenter this afternoon is editor and publisher Liz Coursen. And Liz, who has attended Southside and Pineview schools in Sarasota, moved to Gainesville last year to do research and write 2 books, one about David Levy-Yulee and the other about Virgil Darnell Hawkins. Liz's interest in Dachau began when she edited and published a memoir by a World War II veteran whose unit, the 42nd, was the liberating force at the concentration camp. Since then, she has made a study of the camp and the events surrounding its liberation, and eventually Liz plans to write a book about it. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Dachau first, Dachau last, Dachau jamais plus. Please welcome Liz Coursen.
May I ask you whose biography? I know someone who was in the Point Force.
Okay, we'll talk afterwards.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And before Melanie, come back here for just a second. I told her that I was going to do this, and I'm doing it. So this is Melanie Odom, and Melanie has been here at the Venice Library. Look, she's come on, Melanie. How long?
42 years plus.
42 years. Let's give it up for Melanie Odom. Wow. That is such a testimony for both parties, don't you think? Melanie and the Venice Library to be here for that length of time and that duration. We also have Heather here from the Friends of the Venice Library. Heather, why don't you come up for a second, because I hear a rumor that they're always welcoming volunteers. Heather.
Thanks, Liz. On behalf of the Friends of Venice Library, I'm a volunteer there. I'm also on the board of the Friends. We exist really to support the library. We advocate on behalf of the library, and we provide funding for programs and materials that are outside of the regular library budget funded by the county and the state. So I have a real passion for the library and the team here and everything we do. If you do as well, I invite you to get involved. There's a couple ways you can get involved. One, you can patronize our bookstore, which is right across the way. We accept donations of almost any media, CDs, DVDs, books, magazines. You can purchase things, the same things there. You can become a member. There's membership information right on the table outside. And as Liz said, you can always inquire about volunteer opportunities. It's a great group of people. So thanks for supporting some of the programs that the Friends are helping provide. And I can't wait to hear your talk, Liz.
Thank you so much, Heather. I know that Friends are just integral to the lifeblood of our community libraries, and I wanted to hold up that opportunity for you because I think literacy right now in America is more vitally important than perhaps it has been in the past. So Heather, thank you for being here, and thank you, Melanie. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I did edit and publish the memoir of a World War II veteran, a member of the 42nd Infantry, and that's when I first really started thinking about Dachau as a place, as an event. And my gentleman, my author, did not arrive to Dachau until a couple days later. He was busy liberating Munich at the time, but because Ike Eisenhower suggested that all off-duty personnel visit these camps, my guy went in 2 days later and he saw everything and he smelled everything. So I am going to try to establish the milieu of Dachau, the historic run-up to the concentration camp, the major players, what happened at the liberation of the concentration camp is my focus, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of historic aftermath. I'd like to suggest that if anybody has any questions, do me a favor and hold them, and we'll do Q&A as soon as the program is concluded. All right, let's get started. So the program title is Dachau First, Dachau Last, Dachau Jamais Plus. And I'd like to thank Melanie for that was terrific pronunciation. You could pass as a Francophile. And I might need a little help though with my German. There's a little German coming up. So if anybody speaks a little German, I'm gonna ask for volunteers in just a second. One of the things I've changed about my programming in the last year or so is I used to put my research materials at the end of the program. I wanted people to understand and recognize the sources of the information. But because of the ubiquity of the internet and the fact that you can go on YouTube now and see Oprah Winfrey pushing a pink salt diet, I felt like I should put my sources front and center. I want you to know exactly where the information that I'm going to be conveying to you all today is coming from. So what I'd like to do right now is show you what I feel are the real reliable sources, the source material. And the first one, and the primary one, is the surrender of the Dachau concentration camp on the far left. I brought a copy here. Then I also have the true account, the supplement, which is extremely rare. Then Michael Hirsch wrote The Liberators, America's Witnesses to the Holocaust, fabulous. And then you have Dachau, 29 April 1945, which is a compilation of first-hand accounts, eyewitness accounts of what the 42nd saw when they went through Dachau, and that was edited by Sam Dan. Then you have things that can be best characterized as fiction. And the first one I'd like to talk about is Armageddon by Leon Uris. How many people have read Armageddon? It's terrific. It is terrific. It is also fiction. And I would posit that Alex Kershaw's book, The Liberator, is also fiction, even though he got a lot of Wall Street Journal awards for it. He did not cite surrender of the Dachau concentration camp. And if that's where you start when you have this conversation, and a book does not cite that, I think it's almost worthless. I also did a lot of research with Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, as well as George Patton, because they are players in this larger conversation about Dachau. I also began to collect contemporaneous issues of the Stars and Stripes. And one of the things I was really trying to find, every day there is a map of the prosecution of the war, showing exactly which army is where. So there's a map right there, and I kept looking through the Stars and Stripes to find the location of Dachau. And even on the day of its liberation, even when it did make front page headlines, it was not on the map because it was not a military objective. So I've been collecting these contemporaneous newspaper articles, and it's really interesting. Plus, I have also, over the past, I'd say, 7 years I've been collecting, I have about 500 different items that pertain to Dachau, most of which I bought at auction. Because internationally, this is very collectible. These items come available, and I am hooked into every single auction house on the planet. So I've begun to really collect these things in a very serious way. So these are some of the things that I've collected over time. And I do want to point out, I've got 5 copies of the Surrender book. And usually what I'm looking for is signed copies. But I also have a copy that apparently an editor used because it's got all sorts of notes and arrows, and I really value that. And this is not that copy, because that copy doesn't leave my house. So this is part of the process that you follow when you are going to prepare to edit and publish a book, because you've got to start fact checking. You can't really trust your clients. You've got to fact check it yourself. So let's talk about Dachau. Dachau is a village about 9 miles to the northwest of Munich. How many people have been there? Oh wow, okay. This is great. I hope you're going to learn something that you didn't know before. I've heard it's very dramatic to be there, and I have not yet girded my loins to visit. And I definitely don't want to go by myself. So I'm going to need to find a friend to go, because I've heard it's really very powerful, the experience. But there's Dachau. And Dachau for generations was known as the Greenwich Village of Europe, because it attracted an international group of painters. And so this was a gathering place for a very sophisticated international group of people who painted in the plein air method. So they're literally out in the fields, in the environs of Dachau, painting the bucolic scenes of nature and cows and sheep and streams. These are some examples of Dachau art. Dachau art, if it can be authenticated, commands a premium in the international art market. And in fact, several years ago, Oglethorpe University did a very large showing of Dachau art, and the title of the program was Dachau Before Dachau. Because it turns out that there are 4 Dachaus. There is the village of Dachau, there's the concentration camp at Dachau, there is the SS compound, and there are more than 100 subcamps. So Dachau, the definition of Dachau, got very loosey-goosey as the war was prosecuted. One thing that people don't really focus on about Hitler is that his manifesto, Mein Kampf, was originally published in 1924. So there's been a lengthy run-up to his taking power. We almost think about Hitler seizing power when World War II started, but in fact there was quite a lengthy run-up to him taking over. And then you see him on the cover of Time magazine in 1931, and the caption reads, "Right goes hand in hand with might." 1931. So in 1933, Dachau was established, the first of all the Nazi concentration camps. And it was established by Heinrich Himmler, and he was an ardent Nazi. He was the chief of police in Munich, and he began to repurpose a World War I munitions facility to be the first iteration of the Dachau concentration camp. And initially what happened was, we think of Dachau as a dead end, but initially in the first few years, people were sentenced to specific sentences and then they were released. So initially there was a prison sentence that was put down, you left after you served your sentence. It was only after things really got rolling that Hitler began to target Jews especially. But he was also targeting many people, Catholic priests, Catholic nuns, gypsies, homosexuals, people who wouldn't work, the mentally feeble. He was targeting those people. In fact, that's why he got sideways with the Catholic Church, was his enthusiasm about euthanasia of both the feeble-minded and the elderly. So here's where I need, who can help me with this German word, please? Anybody? I hear some murmuring. Anybody want to try it louder? Okay, so I'm going to try it. Gleichschaltung. Okay, that's as good as I'm going to get. So here we have, this is a very important principle, and this is the marriage of German culture, religious practice, politics, and daily life with the Nazi philosophy, starting in 1933. So pretty early, maybe earlier than we perceive, there was this focus, this marriage of Nazi philosophy with the everyday German's life and way of living. I wanted to mention the Berlin Olympics because this was supposed to be the stage, the early stage for Hitler and his all-white nation. And who should come up? But Jesse Owens, who dominated the track and field events. And interestingly enough, he won, and the person who came in, the man who came in second was, I'll think about it in a second. He came in second to Mac Robinson, who was Jackie Robinson's older brother. So Jackie Robinson's older brother came in second to Jesse Owens. So I thought that was really pretty interesting. But here's what I wanted to show you, is this photo right here. This is Luz Long, and he came in second to Jesse Owens in the long jump, and apparently he was supposed to have given some hints to Jesse Owens that caused Hitler to be very upset. And Hitler apparently retaliated some years later and sent Luz Long to his death in Sicily at the age of 30. Basically sent him into a meat grinder because of this apparent coaching that he did for Jesse Owens. So in 1937, Dachau was enlarged. And it had originally been capable of holding 6,000 prisoners, and it was immediately maxed out as more and more people fell afoul of Hitler, and they began to pour into Dachau. So this is using basically slave labor. And I want to draw a very strange distinction that many people might not recognize. Dachau was not a killing concentration camp, like Buchenwald, for example, or Auschwitz, because if you went there, you were basically going to die. At Dachau, on the other hand, it was a work camp. A little bit of a distinction here, instead of dying immediately, you were worked to death. That's what was going on at Dachau, but that's a minor distinction, but important. So here are some of the symbols. Nazis were very organized and very structured. They had a way of identifying the people in these concentration camps. One thing I thought was particularly interesting was if you had a black triangle, you were a gypsy, or what they call work shy. So basically bums were not allowed to be in the Nazi system because they weren't producing, they weren't productive. So they were incarcerated and they got a black triangle. But green identified convicts and criminals, purple Jehovah's Witnesses, and red were Poles. And sometimes they were combined. So for example, if you were a gay Pole, you got the gay symbol and the Pole symbol, so people could immediately identify who you were and what you were all about. So as I mentioned, this was not an extermination camp, it was simply a work camp. And here are some photos of people on their way. And here's what they leave behind. And we've seen these photos before, but it's really quite heartbreaking to imagine people thinking that they're going someplace and they're going to be safe, and they bring their personal belongings and then they have to be jettisoned. Here's the location of Dachau, and you can see in the lower left, there's the village of Dachau, and here is the concentration camp in the SS barracks, this large area here, and you can see that the concentration camp itself is this basic rectangular red area with a little teeny bit, and I'm going to point to it. This is where the crematoria was, and that's where all the ashes were placed. That gives you a little perspective about where it is in relationship to the village itself. And here's a layout of the Dachau compound. Now, as I mentioned, there are two specific entities within the footprint of this large area. There's the SS installation to our left here, and then here, this rectangular area, is the concentration camp. Now, seemingly, they are contiguous. But in terms of administration, in terms of personnel, in terms of food, every single item, there was hardly any overlap between the concentration camp and the SS compound. So for all intents and purposes, they are distinct, two different entities. And I do want to point out, I mentioned Catholics earlier. If you look at the rectangle, if you look to the left, the third barracks from the top is a little kind of yellowy green. That is where the Catholic priests were housed. And the descriptions of the torture that the Catholic priests had to endure is absolutely horrific. And I'm not going to tell what happened, but it's difficult reading. It's difficult reading. And as I mentioned earlier, there were more than 100 sub-camps. So these camps were installed around the perimeter of Dachau. They were administered by the Dachau administration at the camp. And mostly, if you look down, primarily camps located to where the prisoners worked. So these people, as I mentioned, are being worked to death. And they are being worked to death in munitions factories and farms. And if you talk about frills, if you lived in a sub-camp, whatever frills you might have enjoyed in the main camp were not there. People were literally living in holes in the ground. Very disturbing to think about. Most of the time, a basic soldier had no idea about the prosecution of the war, and certainly was not consulted about the larger big picture. The grunt soldiers, the infantry guys, like my guy, they did what they were told. They went where they were told to go, and they did what they were told to do. So they had very little idea of the larger picture of the prosecution of the war. And here are some infantrymen with one of the open-top tanks. This is a fellow who was with the 42nd who signed this for me. So in April of 1945, basically the Americans were looking at the Germans' backs. The Germans were retreating as fast as they could, and everyone was going towards Munich. The Allies were pursuing the Germans because it was feared that if the Germans were able to get to Munich, they would be able to access the Alps, and it would be guerrilla warfare for the foreseeable future. So the whole purpose of the Allies was to stop the Germans before they got to Munich. And so here you can see in April 1945, we had the 45th, 42nd, the 3rd, and the 20th Armored are marching almost parallel to each other towards Munich. And the positioning of these divisions will impact who got to the concentration camp first. So here's Munich, and you can see the Alps like paradise in the distance. So everyone's trying to get, before the Germans can get to Munich, everyone's trying to stop them. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a gentleman who lives here in Venice, in fact. He was a German fella, and he'd written a book about his experiences in World War II. He was a 12-year-old living in Munich as the American soldiers were approaching. We always think about everything from an American's perspective, but here's a little boy looking out at us coming at him. And he had been raised to believe that the Americans were evil. And he was worried about himself, his mother, and his little sister. And he told me a number of stories that I thought were fascinating. They were starving. They were starving, and he said that he had tried to climb out onto a rafter of a damaged roof to catch a pigeon so that his mother and his sister could have some protein. He fell through the roof, broke his arm badly, and it had to be reset when the Allies arrived. He said that his grandfather had been in charge of the horses during World War I. And of course, horses were not nearly as prominent in World War II, but there were still some horses that were incorporated into the war effort, and the grandfather was still taking care of those few horses. There were fights that broke out when one of the horses died because people were fighting over every square inch of that horse, including its hooves, because everybody was so hungry, absolutely so hungry. But he did say 3 times in his manuscript that it was the Allies' fault that the Germans starved at the end of World War II. And I read the first time, and then I read the second time, and then I read the third time, and I said, how do you figure that? How do you figure that it's America's fault that the Germans were starving at the end of World War II? And he said, well, before the war, everybody knew that Germany had never been self-sufficient in food production. So when the Allies cordoned off Germany, it was inevitable that there'd be starvation. The Nazis, plenty of food. Soldiers, some food. Regular civilians, hardly anything. And who's at the bottom of the barrel? The concentration camp prisoners. They're not going to get anything. So you see, when he said that 3 times, I'm not going to publish your book. There is no way I'm going to publish your book if you say stuff like that. So that, I thought, was very, very interesting, because sometimes you don't realize that there's a line until you see it, and then you know you're not going to cross. So that gentleman, I wish him well, but I'm not going to publish. So in April 1945, as I say, there was an enormous movement away from the Allies. The German army was moving away, and they were trying to get as many of the internees away from the Americans and the advancing Allied armies as possible. They did not want anyone to know what had happened in these concentration camps. So there was a great deal of movement away from the Allies, and we were literally running out of maps because the movement was so quick. Now we come to a real disturbing part of the lecture, the death train from Buchenwald. So on April 7th, 5 days before Buchenwald, the main camp's liberation, a train took off from Buchenwald on its way to Dachau with 3,000 to 4,000 prisoners in this train. And it meandered through the German countryside with a very quick meandering into Czechoslovakia, popped back into Germany on its way to Dachau. During that time, the train was not marked. Allied bombers were trying to bomb it. It did not stop, but one time it stopped. 900 people were forcibly detrained, massacred in a field. The train cars that had carried those people were decoupled, and the train continued. So hold that thought, because we're going to be coming back to that in a minute when it does arrive at Dachau. So on April 12th, 1945, Eisenhower arrived at Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald. He was accompanied by Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. And there they witnessed the charred bodies that the Germans had tried to erase from view. And so you see Ike, he is, if you look very carefully, if you look to the left going right, he's the third man from the left. The fifth man is Omar Bradley, and on the final man in the first row to the right is George Patton. Now I was at the National Holocaust Museum in DC a couple months ago, and this photo is right there. But the problem was, all it said was Ohrdruf. It did not give any kind of recognition to who the players were and why it was important. Why was Ike seeing this important? It was important because his aide said that he had never seen Eisenhower as upset as he became after seeing this concentration camp. And so Eisenhower immediately worried that there would be deniers. Now, how he thought that in the moment, I do not know. But he had the smarts to know, the arch Republican himself, that people would deny that this had taken place. So he sent out an order that if you were not active duty, he wanted the soldiers to cycle through these camps. He got Churchill to do the same thing. So now you have Allied soldiers within days of liberating these camps. Now the people who weren't there, boots on the ground when the liberation occurred, are coming back through. And none of the soldiers could believe it. In fact, my guy went because he had heard things that he did not believe. So these soldiers who had just experienced the horrors of war, honestly, this was a bridge too far, and they did not believe it had happened. One of the interesting things about this particular picture, and my author, who was a member of the 42nd, I had given my author a book about Patton to kind of stimulate his memory, that kind of thing. And in the book, it says that George Patton went around a building and vomited after seeing what he saw at Ohrdruf. And I had known my author, who at this point was 93, 94, he was older. And I'd known him for 6, 8 months at that point, and we'd had some very intense conversations about this. And after knowing him all that time, we were just about to go to press. And he admitted for the first time, I think, in his life, because he had read that George Patton, old blood and guts himself, had puked after seeing Ohrdruf. He admitted to me that he had thrown up after seeing Dachau. And it took that knowing that Patton had that reaction for him to admit for the first time, I believe, in his life that he'd had the same reaction. But I found myself in the National Holocaust Museum explaining who these people were and why it was significant. And if I ever get 5 minutes, I'm going to call them and offer to redo the caption so people understand. But I started I had an impromptu lecture going. I had like 40 people around me as I was explaining what was going on. it's really important that people do a little bit more than just look at a photo. They need to know who's there. And I want to read this because this is Eisenhower. This is contemporaneous to him seeing Ohrdruf. He says, I want every American unit, not actually in the front lines, to see this place. We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against. So I want to just revisit this for a second. So now we're going to start talking about the 45th, 42nd, 3rd, and 20th. Remember, everybody's pushing towards Munich. And you can see a little bit right there, it says Dachau. Everyone's about to be surprised. So here is, these are a few pages from the surrender of the Dachau concentration camp. And I wanted to show you a couple things, and everything's gonna happen really quickly and almost contemporaneously. So what I wanted to show you was the path of the 42nd and the 45th. The 45th starts at E and goes to F, if you can see that. If you look up at the top left, you'll see coal yard shooting area. That's F. Remember that. That's the 45th. However, the 42nd goes all the way around and ends up between A and B. And that's where the surrender of the Dachau concentration camp took place. I'm not talking about the SS compound. I'm talking about the concentration camp. There was a little ceremony that was immortalized with photographers. And you can see some of the people who are the players. You can see them up there. We're going to come back. But think about the difference between the path of the 45th and the path of the 42nd, because we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, April 29th, 1945, Brigadier General Henning Linden and his party are in the village of Dachau, and they approach a couple people who are locals, and the locals say that everybody at the concentration camp has been killed. And there's no reason for anybody to go look anywhere because everybody's dead. But the Brigadier General wants to see for himself. So he's in a party with 5 jeeps, 10 enlisted men, and 3 accredited journalists and 2 photographers. And they are met by 2 French POWs who say, we can take you to the gates of the concentration camp. So they're joined by these 2 POWs, and off they go. And the 42nd, led by Brigadier General Henning Linden, goes directly to the gates. And here they are. So if you look carefully, and you can see the Brigadier General, he's kind of heavy-set and looks very grim, not surprisingly. And so the top photo shows him. The fellow who's back to us is Victor Maurer, and he was a representative of the Swiss Red Cross. And if you look at the bottom photo, you can see the young man to the left is an SS officer. There are 2 SS officers and the Swiss Red Cross who are doing the surrender to the Brigadier General. It turns out that the night before the Brigadier General arrived, almost all the SS who were involved in the administration of the concentration camp had fled. So the SS had brought in a bunch of SS officers and soldiers who were not really familiar with the camp or its administration. So these 2 fellows who were doing this surrender ceremony were brand new to the situation, as were most of the people who were the SS people who were on the ground, because they'd all left. Now you might have heard of Marguerite Higgins. She was at the surrender ceremony. She was dressed in a Russian infantryman's uniform, very bulky. She was trying to hide the fact she was a woman. So she was trying to look like a man in this surrender ceremony, but she went on to report from Korea and from Vietnam. Very, very well known and very, very aggressive woman reporter. So now let's just circle back to the death train for a second. As the 42nd is approaching the camp, they come across the death train. The death train had arrived in Dachau. There were a few people after 3 weeks who were still alive. And the people who were still alive were machine gunned by the SS. So eventually there was nobody alive in these train cars. There were approximately 2,300 corpses. So this is what the 42nd saw as they were approaching the concentration camp. And apparently it looked like just a bunch of old rags, but these were dead people. Very thin, very dead people. And here are a few of the 42nd infantrymen looking at the corpses. So there was one survivor out of the 2,300 people who were still in the cars. 2,300 dead, one person, one young man. So as the 42nd was approaching the death train, Lieutenant Colonel Downard was told by one of his men, one man in the train, because as they had been passing, they saw this one pale hand emerging from the tangled corpses, trying to wave. So Lieutenant Colonel Downard jumped into this train car and pulled out a young, naked Polish man. And believe it or not, after 3 weeks, no food, no water, naked, cold, it was unusually cold that year. The young man, what did he ask for? He looked up at the lieutenant colonel and he had one question. One thing was uppermost in his mind. He did not ask for food. He did not ask for water. He did not ask for clothing. He had one question. Free. Am I free? In a very John Wayne moment, the lieutenant colonel looked down and said, son, the Americans are here. And yes, you are free. You are free. So here's another view, an aerial view, very contemporaneous to April 1945. And you can really see now the footprint of this large compound, and then the concentration camp is that rectangle to the right where it says A. And then B is where they had the crematorium. But the death train was down at 3. So it's lower left. That's where everyone saw it. So when the 42nd arrived at Dachau, there were approximately 40,000 people at the camp. Now remember, this camp had been built for 8,000 people. 40,000 skinny, very sick, emaciated people. And because the Germans, in the waning days of the war, had run out of fuel. Literally, they had run out of fuel. They had no way to dispose of the bodies. So the bodies began to pile up. And we've all seen these photos, but one of the 42nd was quoted as saying that the bodies look like a maniac's woodpile. A maniac's woodpile. And as I mentioned, even though this was not an extermination camp per se, there were still between 35 and 43,000 people who perished at Dachau and its subcamps. So on the day of liberation, here's what they said. This is from the official report by the U.S. 7th Army. Sunday, just after the noon meal, the air was unusually still. The big field outside the compound was deserted. Suddenly, someone began running toward the gate at the other side of the field. Others followed. The word was shouted through the mass of gray, tired prisoners. Americans. Oh, I never can get through them without getting a little emotional. That word repeated, yelled over the shoulders in throaty Polish and Italian and Russian and Dutch, and the familiar ring of French. The first internee was shot down as he rushed toward the gate by the guard, yet they kept running and shouting through eager lips and unbelieving eyes. Americans. And here are some photos of fortunately. And I wanted to point out, as I mentioned, the SS compound and the concentration camp were definitely separated. And here's a great photo. If you look at the photo in the upper left, there is a moat. And this is going to eventually get through to the Amper River into the Danube. But this is the moat, and you can see how if you're standing at the bottom, and usually it's swift running water, but if you're standing at the bottom, you're not going to be able to push yourself up the other side. There's also, if you look at it, it's got an angle to it. And then, if you look very carefully to the place, the strip that's on the far left, that's all scoured, and then there is electrified barbed wire that you can't see. So if you were able to get over the barbed wire on the concentration camp side, down into the moat, on the other side of the moat, get yourself up somehow, you're going to be in a killing field that's completely open. And then there's a track, and then there's the SS compound. So they were definitely very, very separated. And one of the things too that you're looking for, and as you heard Melanie say, I'm going to eventually write a book about this. When you're collecting ephemera about Dachau, you're looking for photos that haven't been published, and a lot of them have. So not too long ago, I bought this book from an auction in Jerusalem. I think it's in Czechoslovakian. I'm not sure what language this is, but it has unpublished photos in the back, and that's why I bought it. And I haven't looked at them since I bought them. If you keep this stuff in your head, you can't. And that's why I never do any research after dinner, because I'll have nightmares. Start looking at these photos, can't do it. So I wanted to show a little bit more about some of these players. I wanted to show that full photo to the left. You can see that there's a young man to the right who's got his hands behind his head, and that is the young SS officer. The man to his right is Lieutenant Wickert. The lieutenant had arrived the night before and taken over the administration of the camp specifically to effect the surrender. Both of those two men had asked for safe custody. The brigadier general had forced them, the three of them, and that's Victor Maurer, the Swiss Red Cross guy. The brigadier general had been so angry when he saw the death train that he forced those two SS officers to go down and look at it with Victor Maurer. And obviously they did not care to look at it very closely. And I believe that both of those two men did not survive the day. I don't know for a fact, but I don't think that they survived. And if you look at these photos, the bottom, these are the players. This is the young man that you see with his arms up there, and all these people are identified, which gives you a lot of confidence about what you're reading. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the 45th. You might recall that the 45th was a little bit to the north of the 42nd. Because they were a little bit to the north, and all these guys are going almost at the same rate towards Munich. So the 45th encountered the SS compound. And the SS compound, the men in the SS compound evidently were the only people on the planet that did not know that the Americans were approaching, because there was a hell of a fight in the SS compound with the 45th. So the 45th was pretty much bogged down by the SS. Now this is a scandalous situation for the US Army, because there was a massacre of SS guards and officers who were unarmed by members of the 45th. And the reason they gave for this massacre of these unarmed enemy combatants was because they had just seen that death train. And these were men who, this is the end of the war, and they've seen everything. They have seen it all, but nobody had seen that death train or anything like it. So according to the leaders of the 45th, its members became overwrought. And that's what led to this massacre in the coal yard. If you look carefully, there are bodies along the wall. You can see 1 man, 2 men, 3 men. If you look carefully on the far right, there's another man. So you've got 4 SS men, and you've got a lot of them dead because there's been a machine gun, and they have been machine gunned by members of the 45th. You can see, too, the tracks for the trains and the scoop for the coal yard right there. So that's where we are, and that's where the 45th is. So hold that thought for a sec. One of the things that both Eisenhower and Churchill demanded was that the Germans go through these camps. And that was not negotiable. So Germans the Americans kept saying that the Germans were saying neo-Nazi, neo-Nazi, neo-Nazi. And it's hard to understand how that claim can be taken seriously because you've got the smell. Think about how smelly it is when your next door neighbor is barbecuing a steak. Multiply that by tens of thousands of human bodies, and you've got a smell. Also, the water supply to Munich had been infected because of improper burial practices. So there was typhus in the water. So to say that you didn't know, it's a stretch. It's a real stretch. So the smell in the water supply being contaminated was sort of an indicator. So I did want to say, and as I've already said, that my friend, it took him forever to trust me enough with something so personal as him vomiting after seeing what he saw. His two friends went through the camp without a problem, but he had to stop within 20 minutes of looking because he was physically unable to continue. And as I mentioned earlier, Dachau was never on any map. Here are some maps from Stars and Stripes, and you watch the prosecution of the war. Dachau, even on the day that it was on the front page, Yanks sees Dachau camp. It's still not on the map. It's still not on the map. It was not a military objective. And of course, here are some very contemporaneous things that were taking place. So 32,000 in German hell camp here. Dachau is right there, but also the fact that Mussolini was murdered with his mistress. Then you have the Japanese surrender. And I have this paper because my veteran was from Buffalo, and I wanted him to see it. Does anybody remember this? I bet grandparents and parents remember. It must have been a thrill when Japan surrendered. And of course, now Time magazine is going to print Hitler is gone and the Japanese are gone in terms of, and these things are not without value. So if you have this kind of collectible material in your home, in your garage, go out and take a look at it, because this morning this was $7,000 on eBay, which is pretty nice for something I think that cost originally was $250. It was not much money, whatever it was. I can't stress this enough in this day of artificial intelligence and everything else that's going on. The source of your information is vital. You cannot just absorb things from the internet anymore, if you ever could. So once again, these are the reliable sources, and then you've got the fiction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fiction in just a second, because I want to talk about inaccuracies, and this is why it's so important that we scrutinize the material that we're taking in. Let's look at some inaccuracies. Okay, this is a very widely published map. And if you look, you'll see here's Munich, right there. But Dachau is not to the northwest, it's to the northeast of Munich. So they're not even placing Dachau in the right location on this map. I think that's a real problem. But here we have the 45th. And I'm going to talk a teeny bit, not being a military veteran myself, but I'm still going to talk about it, about stolen valor. Because 40 years after the official liberation, as documented in the surrender of the Dachau concentration camp, the leader of the 45th positioned himself as the liberator of the concentration camp, despite the fact that he is nowhere in the photos of the actual surrender. And he made a claim. Anybody in here a military veteran? Okay. the leader of the 45th, his name was Felix Sparks, claimed that he hit the brigadier general with a riding crop to stop what the brigadier general was doing. Now, I don't know much about military action, but when you're a lower rank and you do not hit a brigadier general with a riding crop and expect to keep your position. So that's why I know that's a flat out lie. But anyway, so there have been books, and this is one of them, The Liberator, that makes this claim that Felix Sparks was in fact the liberator of the concentration camp. And the problem is that now that this claim has been made, it's gaining traction, because now people feel like they can't say one thing without also saying this other view. So now, here's from Wikipedia, photograph allegedly showing, there's nothing allegedly about this, this is what happened, allegedly showing an unauthorized execution of SS troops in a coal yard in an area of the Dachau concentration camp during its liberation. I got news for you, that's not the concentration camp. That is the SS compound. It is not part of the concentration camp. So we're starting to pick apart what Wikipedia now, the authority of the world, is now publishing. That's simply not so. So if you look and see where F is, that's the coal yard. Then you look down between A and B, that's where the surrender took place. So how Felix Sparks claims to have gotten from F to A and B and then hit the brigadier general with a riding crop doesn't make any sense. Not to me. Not to me. And here they are again, and you start looking at the distances, and you can see that it just doesn't work out. Then there are also things that come up on eBay, for example, that claim to be Dachau, but aren't. And you have to know the configuration of the camp and its environs to know what you're looking at. I think what's happened here is someone has written Dachau concentration camp on the back of this postcard to up the value, because this is not the concentration camp. I can't even place this. It might be in the village of Dachau, but I contacted the guy who's selling it on eBay, and I said, you know, I know a little bit about Dachau. Please tell me where this is. And he came back and he starts telling me about the barracks. So you can see there's some demolished buildings in the upper right. He starts telling me about the barracks being demolished. And I said, yeah, but those weren't demolished until the 1960s. And this is not the 1960s. So then he wouldn't reply. And he still has this up and it hasn't sold. So I think that other people who are knowledgeable also are asking questions, because none of these architectural details are the concentration camp or the SS compound. So you have to be careful. You have to be real careful. And so here we have these aerial views, pretty much contemporaneous to the liberation. None of the architectural details are that postcard. So I told you the story of the young Polish man who ended up, by the way, surviving and living in Fort Lauderdale. Isn't that cool? I need to find out his name. I don't know his name, but I know that he lived in Fort Lauderdale. So I told you the story, and I've asked you to be more critical. I've asked you to be discerning. What is different about what I told you in that photo?
He's not naked.
That's right. So he is not naked. He is not naked. So within 3 minutes of what happened, whatever happened, the U.S. Army is manipulating the message. And I'm not being pejorative here. I'm not trying to sound critical. I'm just pointing out that the story goes he was naked when he was found, but he's not naked now. Somebody put clothing on him to manipulate the message. He was cold, definitely he was cold, and he was naked. His photos, naked photos, I agree. But it's still been manipulated. And that is, by the way, Lieutenant Colonel Downer. So my author, part of the 42nd, went back several times to Dachau. And one of the times he went was in 1982 when this plaque was put up in the village of Dachau. And he saw in the square bullet holes in a wall. And he asked about that because German cities are usually very well kept. And he was told this story. Apparently, a lot of the prisoners were marched back and forth through the actual village. And some of the villagers were unhappy about the treatment of the prisoners. Apparently they were being beaten, not taken care of, and they approached the Burgermeister and said, hey, do we have to be so cruel? Does it have to be this way? And the Burgermeister said, tell you what, let's talk about that. Let's get a group of our village leaders together and we will discuss it. We'll meet at the SS officer's office in a couple of days. So they gather some village leaders. They all go to the SS officer. He lines them up against the wall and shoots them all. So the Burgermeister, that Burgermeister, told my guy in 1992 that those bullet holes will always be there to remind people. So there's not too much that looks like it's changed. If you squint and you look at Dachau, a postcard of Dachau, 1913, 1970s, not a lot of change. And Dachau today looks very much the same, very much in keeping with the way it was when it was known as the Greenwich Village of Europe. But certainly, Dachau will always be known for the concentration camp. And never again. It was the first, it was the last, and certainly many people are swearing jamais plus. This is a little pamphlet that was published fairly contemporaneously, but also has value. $1,750 is the asking price for this very small pamphlet. And there's been a huge movement away from the truth about the Holocaust. And what I keep saying to people is, I go back to Eisenhower. I go back to Eisenhower that day, April 12, 1945, at the Wardrow concentration camp, and him looking at the charred bodies, and him knowing somehow that there would be deniers, because there were deniers almost immediately. And here's a pamphlet. This is actually more contemporaneous, 1978, but this fellow was claiming that the dead bodies were actually war dead from bombed cities, including Dresden, and that they had arranged the bodies to make it look like they were in concentration camps and that's how they died. But there have been very, very organized efforts to deny the Holocaust since it happened. And here we have a beautiful, beautiful picture. This went for $5,500, I want to say, at an international auction. And of course, the sacrifice that America made, other countries made, we'll never get those boys back. I'm sure you all have seen the acres of white crosses. And this is what Dachau concentration camp looks like today. And here we are looking from north to south, and you can see that the administration building is still there. There have been a couple churches that have been erected on the space, and you can really see the layout there. A lot of this material does come up for auction. A lot of it comes up on eBay. And every time I see a large collection from a World War II veteran, it makes me kind of sorry that these things are not staying with the families. I think that this would be an amazing, amazing part of a family's heritage. So I want to encourage you, take this opportunity and to encourage you. This came up on eBay last year. If your family is not interested, give it away. Make sure it's preserved. Give it to a local historical society. There are all sorts of places that will take this material and make sure that it's properly preserved. It's really so very important. Now, my guy, he and I did a bunch of, well, it was right during COVID, and he's in his 90s. So I was very reluctant to get him out in public, but we did do, I want to say 22 events together. And we teased out from his memoir just the Dachau part. That was all we talked about. And we talked about Dachau in schools, in churches, and in libraries. We presented up at Gulfgate, the Gulfgate Library. And it was the last program we did together. Chuck was definitely, at that point, I believe he was 93 or 4. He was definitely getting less active. So we've done the program, it's winding down. And I suddenly got this wild hair, and I was gonna be the next Oprah Winfrey. Ooh. I was gonna be the next Oprah Winfrey, and I was going to ask my client a question that we never discussed, just coming out of the blue. Now I have to set this up for a second because my client and I, we had one issue. We were absolutely never going to see eye to eye. And I had to take him aside when we started working and say, Chuck, you know, you think this, and I think that, and we're never going to change each other's mind. So why don't we take that and push it to the side and not discuss this thing? And we agreed, and we got along famously for a couple years, having set that one issue aside. So I'm standing in the Gulfgate Library, he's sitting to my left, and I'm gonna be Oprah Winfrey. All right. So I look down at him, and I say, Chuck, you've lived a very happy and successful life, a long life, an important life. And if you have one thing that you'd like to leave with our audience, one thing, what would it be? And as soon as these words are leaving my mouth, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he's gonna start talking about the one thing that I wanted to avoid for 2 years. He's gonna start talking about it. Oh, I'm not as smart as I thought. So Chuck looks at me and he can see what I'm thinking. He can see the panic and horror in my eyes. And so he tips me this wink that nobody can see because he's facing me and he's winking away and nobody saw it. And without missing a beat, Chuck did me proud. He turned to the audience and he said one word, and this is the conclusion of my program, everybody. He said one word. The one thing, as 94-year-old, he wants to leave with his audience, and that one word, my friends, was vote. So I'd love to take some questions, but I have to say that you've heard everything I know. So I will say one more thing, a little story about Chuck, now that I'm on that topic. He and I were up at the Senior Friendship Center in Sarasota, and we were about to give the program, and a German lady, very thick accent, very red hair, rushes over to me and starts yelling. Why did we need to talk about Dachau? Why did we need to revisit this unhappy time for everyone? Couldn't we put it behind us? She had tried to prevent the program from being presented. I mean, it got loud. And so someone came over from staff and kind of ushered her away. And then, in the middle of the program, she pops back out from around the corner, and she's yelling and carrying on. And so my little author is in his 90s, so I interpose my body between her and him because I'm afraid she's going to start to, get in his face. And so I looked at the audience, and I said to everybody, I said, how many of y'all have been to Dachau? And this being an audience of baby boomers, nearly every hand went up. And I said, how many of y'all have learned something new about Dachau today? And every hand went up. And so I turned to this lady, and as kindly as I could, I said, ma'am, we've got to continue to talk about this because people need to know. And so she was escorted away, and we never saw her again. But that's like one of the worst nightmares of a public speaker is to be heckled. And so now I've had that experience about this program. love to answer any questions, and after the program, you're welcome to come up, and if someone can tell me what language this book is written in, I'd love to know. I would love to know. Does anybody have any questions? Anything that you'd like to add? Yes, sir, I saw you first.
You're not Jewish,
I'm not.
and you're Catholic, I think.
I'm Episcopalian.
Episcopalian, even
Yes.
more so. What got you interested in this topic, in the whole issue of the Holocaust in Dachau in particular? What piqued your interest? Because you certainly didn't have a personal stake as someone who would be Jewish.
No.
So that's my question.
Okay, well, and that's a good question, a valid question, because I do not have any German, background. I'm not a gypsy, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. I mean, what is the connection? It was simply the force of my author's personality, The Greatest Generation. And the fact that he would tell me things, for example, he told me a story about, and this was late in the publishing process. I mean, we hadn't published yet, but we pretty much had finalized our material. And he started telling me the story about how he had been standing with a buddy, and there was a noise, and his buddy's head had been blown off his buddy's body. And he looks around, and his buddy is now on the ground. It's muddy, it's cold, and he spent 2 hours looking for his buddy's head in the freezing mud. And I said, Chuck, nowadays, people would talk about the gouts of blood and the brain matter and, all the things that we now are so used to seeing and hearing and knowing. And Chuck said, what if the man's family read about it? What if they read about how he died? And I thought, who thinks about anybody else anymore? This guy is someone who I can use as a role model for my own life. So this was the power of a real positive role model pivoted me. Now, I will say that I was doing research about the Rosenwald schools, so Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, that's a really interesting topic. And how I got into African American and Jewish American history as it pertains to Florida, I do not know. But it is a rabbit hole that I'm solidly in, and really interesting, really interesting. I mean, to get a chance to go to the U.S. Holocaust Museum and know more about the photos on the wall than they are showing and be able to share that, I mean, why not? It's important, this message, it's gotta get out. And I think somebody here, yes ma'am.
Yes. First of all, good family friend was in the reconnaissance troop of the 42nd. He was 19 years old. His name was Richard Morowitz, and he was a family friend. And he didn't die in the war, just to let you know.
Yeah.
And he was one of the first men at Dachau.
Yeah.
He was there, and I wanted to add something to this whole thing.
Can I ask you one question before?
Sure.
Just hold that thought. Did he ever talk about it? Most of these men did not.
Not for a long time.
Okay.
There was a reunion of the 42nd,
Mm-hmm.
many years later,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And then he became very active, and he gave a lot of talks in schools,
Cool.
etc.
Uh-huh.
But one of the things that happened to him was I think very interesting, and something that people could read about and see his lecture on YouTube. He was told the next day, a bunch of men were told the next day that Hitler was in Munich, okay? So they set out to go find him. And they went into his apartment, and the maid came to the door, and the place was empty. Richie went around and was just looking, and high on a closet shelf was a beaver skin hat with gold threaded initials AH. So he took the hat and he stomped on it. Hence the name, the stomp around, that was heard around the world, okay? He stomped on it and he left. That night, they were in a bar, and the guy said, let's go back and get the hat. So they went back and got the hat, and there's pictures of them with the hat on, and combs or their fingers
Sure.
underneath, okay? And he had the hat, and a few souvenirs in the bottom of a closet. My husband played with his son down in the family room, and they were always told never to go in the closet. What was the first thing they did? Okay, they went in the closet, okay? So for many, many years, this hat was used as a prop and things, okay, I know.
Okay.
But it has since been donated. It was at the Holocaust Museum for a while, and now it's at another museum. But it's a really neat story, and it is interesting to listen to if you want to listen to something further about Dachau.
And this is on YouTube?
Yes.
Okay, great. And the gentleman's name is
Richard Marowitz.
Richard Marowitz, so we can all look at that.
It's something just to add to this situation.
And that jogs my memory because the gentleman in Venice whose memoir I refused to publish also said that every morning they would watch as 3 trucks.
Please use the microphone.
Sorry. Every morning, they would watch as 3 trucks came from Dachau to Munich. And the prisoners in these trucks were tasked with, what would you call it if you're trying to take a bomb, diffusing unexploded Allied ordnance? That's what they were tasked to do. And the deal was that if they were able to defuse 3 bombs, they would be set free. But no one ever found out whether that was going to be true or not, because no one ever survived. And apparently the Allied ordnance might not have blown up the first time, but if you mess with it enough, it's going to explode. So they never found out whether they would be freed after the 3rd bomb. It's very disturbing. As a matter of fact, it's a tough program to present, and it's a tough program to hear. I think people are coming into these lectures sometimes and they think that somehow history can change. As much as we'd like to find that history can change, and certainly I can't change it, but I think we need to know it. I think we all need to know it, and I think we need to share it. Absolutely. I really appreciate you all coming out today. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Venice Library and the Friends of Venice Library.